the rain fell soft on the stone courtyards of France, like a whisper before the breaking of glass. In the year of our Lord 1328, the bells of kings rang hollow, for the Capetian line, proud and centuries long, had drawn its final breath. Charles IV, the Fair, son of Philip the Fair, had died without a male heir. His blood had ended, and with it, the tether that had held the crown steady for generations. France, ancient and aching, now stood before a question it was not prepared to answer. Who now is king? In England, across the Channel, the tide turned uneasily. Edward III, young and fierce, wore the Plantagenet crown. His mother, Isabella, known in her time as the she-wolf of France, had Capetian blood in her veins. Through her, Edward staked his claim not just as an English monarch, but as a rightful heir to the French throne. Yet France would not yield to an English king. The French nobles, wary of foreign hands grasping Gallic soil, turned their gaze to Philip of Valois, cousin to the fallen Charles, a man of noble birth, but of thinner claim. Still, he was French, and that mattered more than law. Thus, Philip VI was crowned in Reims, and a quiet war was born. Not in the clash of swords, but in the trembling of parchment, in whispers through the court halls, in the tightening grip of pride. But the earth knew, the fields knew, the rain knew. For nothing in this world stirs such tempests as wounded bloodlines and wounded pride. And so, the air thickened with waiting. The 100 Years' War would not come as a single storm. It would come as seasons, as cycles of planting and burning, of peace and shattered truce, of sons buried beneath banners stitched with lions and lilies. It would span 5 generations. Monarchs would be born, crowned and entombed before its embers faded. From the harvest fields of Poitiers to the sodden banks of the Seine, from the creaking decks of ships in the Channel to the silent abbeys where monks prayed for peace, it would linger like a ghost. A war with no true name and no final breath. Yet here, in this first moment, when the question of a crown opened like a wound, the world held its breath. No trumpet sounded, no sword was drawn, and still the very spirit of Christendom felt something shifting. In the eyes of merchants, in the mutterings of knights, in the cold stone of castles once thought eternal, a change, a reckoning, a great unraveling. The people, poor and noble alike, turned their gaze skyward. The old order of things had cracked. A king had died, and in the silence left behind, ambition gathered like thunderheads. Edward of England would wait. He was not yet ready to strike. But his eyes, blue and unflinching, watched France with a patience learned from exile and fire. He had known rebellion in his boyhood. He had tasted the bitterness of treachery and the sharp flavor of vengeance. He would not be denied forever. And Philip of France, the newly crowned, walked the halls of his court with the uneasy posture of a man who knew that peace was borrowed, not won. The people murmured, the nobles whispered, old alliances shifted like reeds in river wind. For if the English king believed he had claim, then war, though distant, was inevitable. The seeds were sown not in fire, but in doubt, not in banners, but in blood. Time, slow and sacred, began to turn its wheel. In this age, to be born was to inherit the memory of Rome and the burden of Christendom. To live beneath a crown was to carry both protection and weight. And to draw a sword against kin, against the lands of shared saints and common saints' days, was to shatter something older than law. And yet, shatter it they would. The 100 Years' War would not be only a clash of swords. It would be a struggle for identity, of what it meant to be French, to be English, to be king. It would be waged in fields and in manuscripts, in marriages and betrayals, in the stories told to sons too young to hold blades. It would be a war of inheritance, a war of pride, and above all, a war of memory, for those who lived it and those who would remember it in shadow and in sleep. And so we begin. In this still hour, with the fire low and the night surrounding you like the hush of cathedral stone, we begin the story of the war that lasted 100 years and more. Close your eyes. Let the rain of 1328 fall softly in your mind. Let the bells of old kings toll, distant but unforgotten. Let the throne stand empty. And listen, the crown has no master. The earth has begun to stir. And across the channel, a young king watches and waits. In the heart of Europe, where cathedrals rose like prayers cast in stone, blood was the ink that wrote the names of kings. Not spilled blood, not yet, but blood traced through scrolls, through grandmothers' names and forgotten cousins' sons. In a time when law bowed to lineage, and lineage twisted through centuries of marriage and ambition, the world turned on ancestry like a wheel of fate, and the wheel had begun to creak. Let us walk backward now into the quiet chambers of time and open the ledger of bloodlines. For over 300 years, the Capetian dynasty had ruled France, a line that began with Hugh Capet in the year 987, when the memory of Charlemagne still haunted the minds of monks and kings alike. From father to son, without break, the crown had passed. A golden river that never split, never faltered. Until it did. Charles IV, the Fair, had died childless. His brothers, Louis X and Philip V, had also left no sons who survived infancy. And so, for the first time in living memory, the Capetian River dried up. It did not end with a sword or siege, but in the stillness of deathbeds and the silence of cradles. The question now was this: could the crown pass through the female line? The French barons said no. Sur Saint-Tournard. Centuries earlier, in 1316, the precedent had been whispered into place. A law cloaked in sacred dignity, later named Salic law, though older than the term itself. According to this unwritten rule, no woman could inherit the throne of France, and no claim could be made through a woman. The land of Charlemagne, it was said, must never fall under the sway of foreign princes through a daughter's marriage. This was not merely preference, it was fear. For a daughter of France, once wed, became the property of another realm, and France feared becoming property. So when Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV through his mother Isabella, put forth his claim, it was not met with mere skepticism, it was met with rejection and dread. For though his blood was Capetian, his soul was English, and that made him an outsider, a threat, a claim that could unmake the kingdom. The Plantagenets, Edward's line, were no strangers to France. For centuries they had ruled great swaths of French land as dukes and counts, even as they served as kings of England. Their roots sank deep into Normandy, into Anjou, into Aquitaine. These were not foreign lords, but Franco-English hybrids, both rival and kin. But it was precisely this entanglement that turned loyalty into suspicion. The Plantagenets held titles within France, yet sat on a foreign throne. They spoke French, married French wives, even died in French soil. But their crown, their core, lay across the Channel. And now Edward dared to demand all, not just duchies, not just homage, but France itself. Philip VI of Valois, nephew to Philip the Fair, was chosen instead. Though his bloodline curved wider, it was still Capetian. He was male, and more importantly, he was French. His coronation at Reims was meant to be a balm, a sign of continuity, an anchor in uncertain seas. But anchors can rust. Even as Philip took the throne, doubts clung to him. Was he truly the rightful king, or merely the one most convenient? Did the crown sit on his head by law or by fear? Edward remained silent at first. Young, unsteady, and still wrangling his own nobles, he had no army yet to send, no fleets to summon. But his silence was not surrender. It was patience, a storm held in breath. In this space between coronations and campaigns, the roots of the 100 Years' War stretched and thickened. It would be easy to say it was about a crown, about 2 men and 1 throne. But it was more than that. It was about pride and survival, about old ghosts and territorial envy, about wine and wool, about language and marriage, about what it meant to be sovereign and what it meant to belong. For the French, it was a matter of keeping the kingdom whole, of resisting the tide of English ambition that had already swept Normandy centuries before. For the English, it was a matter of justice, of inheritance denied, of insult cloaked in law. Both believed they were right. Both believed the other was dangerous, and neither would bend. In the quiet years before war broke open, ambassadors crossed the channel like cautious birds. Treaties were drafted, torn, and redrafted again. Hostages were exchanged. Nobles made oaths they never intended to keep. But all the while, the claim lingered like incense over an altar. Edward's blood was Capetian. Philip's crown was Capetian. And the sacred line, once a river, now a web, caught them both in its threads. The world was watching. The barons of England, the dukes of Burgundy, the Pope in Avignon, the merchants of Flanders, all held their breath. For beneath the veneer of diplomacy, the drums of something older were beginning to stir, a reckoning by right of blood. In every monastery, scribes began to write new genealogies. In every court, whispers of war were tucked behind smiles. And in every field from Gascony to Calais, the earth prepared, silently, to drink. Not yet. Not tonight. But soon. The sons of kings would march, carrying the quarrels of the dead upon their backs. And France would never be the same. Before the banners rose and steel met bone, before the thunder of cavalry or the first broken wall, the war gathered not in the barracks, but in the markets, in the quiet wars of wool and wine. It was not swords that first drew blood, but trade. Let us turn now to the soft lands of Flanders. There, beneath a grey sky and low golden sun, cities buzzed with spinning wheels, looms, and the hum of commerce. Ghent, Bruges, Ypres, the heartbeat of the cloth world, a region not born of conquest, but of creation, where the hands of weavers and dyers turned sheep's wool into wealth. But that wool, it came from England. And in that dependence, a quiet string was tied between the English crown and the fate of Flanders. A string that would soon be pulled taut by kings and broken by war. The Flemish cities were rich, stubborn, and proud. They owed nominal allegiance to the King of France, who ruled over them as overlord of the Low Countries. But their real lifeblood, the source of their gold, their wages, their survival, came across the Channel. English wool clothed the world, and England knew it. It knew the cloth makers of Flanders needed its flocks, that to choke off the flow of wool was to choke the breath from Flemish throats. And in that knowing, a weapon was found, one not forged in iron, but grown in fields and sheared with hands. Philip VI of France, already watching Edward III with unease, sensed this leverage too. He sought to tighten his grip on Flanders, to bring its cities closer to his chest. To do so meant severing the English connection, and to sever that tie, he would have to risk war, not on battlefields, but in guild halls. In 1336, the silence shattered. Philip ordered a ban on English wool. He sought to cripple the cloth trade. to punish the cities that leaned toward Edward, and to remind all vassals, even those cloaked in trade, that the French crown was still iron beneath its gold. The effect was swift and sharp. Unrest spread through Flanders like fire in dry hay. The weavers, deprived of raw wool, rioted. Guilds cried out against the French crown, and into this boiling tension stepped Edward, not with armies, but with offers. He sent envoys, promises, and coin. He whispered of freedom from France, of trade restored, of alliance. And slowly, like a tide creeping through broken levees, Flanders began to lean toward England, not just out of greed, but out of need. For hunger, not loyalty, makes men rebel. Among the loudest voices in the Flemish Rising was a man of no noble birth, Jacob van Artevelde of Ghent. A merchant, a guild leader, a man who spoke not for kings, but for weavers. And yet, in this hour, his words mattered more than crowns. He led the Flemish cities into revolt, not as rebels against France alone, but as guardians of their trade, their food, their future. And he found in Edward III not just a wool seller, but a potential liberator. In 1337, Flanders declared its support for Edward. Van Artevelde helped orchestrate a pact that recognized Edward as King of France, not just in name, but in hope. The war, once a slow boil of politics, now crackled into open flame. This was the first open defiance, the first moment where claim became conflict, where whispers became banners. Yet even now, it was not a war of battles. Not yet. It was a war of embargoes, of marriages refused, of alliances shifting like shadows. It was a chess game played across harbors and grain routes, where the first blood spilled was not on a blade, but in a ledger. Still, tension deepened. England began to prepare its fleets. France gathered its armies. Treaties with Scotland, England's old thorn, were renewed. Germany, caught in its own feudal fractures, watched. The Pope urged peace with ink and tears. But peace had already fled the room. In the halls of Westminster, Edward now fully embraced the mantle of claimant. He no longer disguised his intentions. He declared himself not only King of England, but also of France, and minted coins with both titles etched in silver. This was no longer posturing. This was provocation, and Philip knew it. A king could not suffer a rival king within his borders, not in name, not in coin, not in soul. The old laws of blood had become a field of thorns, and both kings stepped into them willingly, because pride, once wounded, does not heal. It hardens, and then it demands war. Meanwhile, in Flanders, the great tapestry of allegiance unraveled further. The weavers returned to work thanks to English wool. But France, never tolerant of rebellion, began to threaten siege. Jacob van Artevelde stood between two worlds, praised in England, marked for death in France. He saw clearly what others only feared, that this conflict would not remain in courts or markets. It would break into fire, into steel, into smoke over fields, but he would not live to see its end. His vision of a free, English-aligned Flanders would one day die by the hands of his own countrymen, a martyr to commerce, caught in the crush between kings. But that was later. For now, he helped lift the curtain on what would become the great theater of the 100 Years' War, and the actors had taken the stage. So here, let us pause. In the hum of the loom, in the scent of wet wool, in the silence before siege. For this was how it began, not with glory, not with honor, but with trade routes severed, with weavers starving, with kings claiming wool as weapon. The earth had not yet swallowed its first soldier, but it would, before great battles carved their names into memory, before Poitiers, Crécy, and Agincourt, the first blades of the 100 Years' War were drawn not in the north, where the cloth cities seethed, but far to the south, where salt met wine, and a duchy clung to the edge of two crowns. Guyenne, also called Aquitaine, a name as old as the Romans and as sweet on the tongue as the grapes that grew in its soil. A land of warm vineyards, slow rivers, and stubborn loyalty. Here, English kings had ruled as dukes since the days of Eleanor, the queen who once held half of France in her palm. But their rule had always been conditional, feudal, fragile. For the King of England was also, in theory, a vassal to the King of France. And there lies the poison. No king bows his knee for long. The duchy was a jewel, not just of sentiment, but of gold. Its ports, Bordeaux, Bayonne, La Rochelle, flowed with wine and salted goods, their ships feeding England's thirst for claret and France's greed for taxes. Whoever ruled Guyenne held the keys to trade along the Garonne and to the hearts of the Gascon nobles, men proud and fierce and not easily ruled. And yet the land was a wedge. Edward III held it as a duke, swearing nominal fealty to Philip VI. But as Edward began calling himself the rightful king of France, Philip struck back in kind, not with armies, but with parchment. In 1337, the French king issued the formal confiscation of Guyenne, a quiet act, a letter, a revocation of titles. But in that stroke of ink, he declared war. To the world, it seemed legal. Just another feud between vassal and lord. But Edward saw it clearly. This was no longer dispute. This was erasure. A symbolic stripping of his claim not only to land, but to dignity. To let it stand would be to admit inferiority, to admit falsehood. To shrink, he would not. Instead, he answered in the only tongue kings share when paper fails, by raising ships. He sent fleets to the Channel, levied soldiers from Cornwall to Kent, and summoned archers from the northern shires. Across the sea, France too gathered arms, conscripts from the Pyrenees to the Seine, banners stitched with lilies, swords consecrated in cathedral light, and so began the first true campaigns of the 100 Years' War. Not in fields of glory, but in the tangled alleys of Bordeaux and the salt-swept fortresses of Guyenne. The French pressed southward first. Philip sent armies to seize key strongholds, Blaye, Bourg, and Saint-Macaire, outposts that clung to the Gironde estuary like ancient stones refusing the tide. Town by town, they sought to squeeze the English out, but Guyenne was not yet ready to fall. For the people, Gascons, lords and burghers, had long memories. They remembered the chaos of French interference, the bloodied tolls, the harsh hands of northern tacksmen. Many still viewed the English not as invaders, but as protectors. Not out of love, perhaps, but loyalty forged in decades of relative peace. So they resisted, not with grand armies, but with stubborn defense. Castle gates slammed shut, narrow bridges burned, wells poisoned. They fought like a land accustomed to being overlooked, fiercely, without fanfare. And Edward, from across the Channel, promised aid. In 1338, the first English reinforcements arrived, not in legions, but in careful waves. They came ashore with salt in their cloaks and longbows slung across their backs. These were not the armored knights of story, but hardened yeomen, men who had hunted for survival and now aimed for war. From fortified towns, they struck out in sorties, harassing French positions, reclaiming lost forts, raiding supply lines like wolves in darkened woods. They could not hold vast land, but they could bleed the enemy. And bleed them they did. Meanwhile, along the coast, English ships turned the sea into weapon. In Bayonne, naval skirmishes erupted, swift and brutal clashes of oar and flame. Merchant vessels were commandeered, salt hulks turned into floating arcs of siege. The wine trade halted, the estuary choked with fire, and amid it all, the people suffered. Because war is not a clean story. It drips into wells, it seeps into bread, it clings to children's dreams like ash. And still it was only beginning. Edward knew he could not defend Guyenne forever from afar. He would need allies, money, a broader front. So he turned north, to Flanders again, to the Holy Roman Empire, to the web of alliances that could turn a regional fight into continental upheaval. The war was stretching. Guyenne had been the opening wound, a place of memory, of claim, of economic leverage. But even as it bled, Edward's eyes were on greater prizes. He saw not just duchies to defend, but a crown to reclaim. And France, for all its pride, now saw the cost of underestimating the English lion. For this lion was clever. This lion remembered. And this lion was learning how to strike. And thus in the vineyards of Aquitaine, vines still clung to their trellises. The soil, long fertile, now tasted blood. Churches stood silent amid the rattle of siege towers, and the wind carried new prayers, not of peace, but of vengeance. This was no longer a feud of nobles. It was a war of identity. Was Guyenne French because of law and lordship, or English because of history and will? The question had no answer, only swordplay. And so, the siege lines wrapped tighter, the sea turned grey with ash. And the 100 Years' War, once a dispute of bloodlines, became a struggle for land, for wealth, for survival. The Duchy of Guyenne would change hands many times in the years to come. But in this first campaign, a truth was revealed, that no land, no port, no river or vineyard could remain neutral. Not anymore. As the flames of Guyenne flickered into siege and smoke, Edward III stood not only as king, but as gambler. For though his armies had tasted the first salt of battle, and his banners fluttered on the battlements of Aquitaine, the truth remained. He could not win this war alone. France, vast and wealthy, boasted more men, more gold, more horses, more lords. England, proud but smaller, could not outmatch her foe by force of numbers, and so Edward, like the hawks his knights trained for royal hunts, turned his gaze beyond the Channel, to the scattered courts of the Holy Roman Empire, to cobbled cities and petty dukes, to gilded thrones and German iron, to allies, bought in gold and bound in silk. The empire, that sprawling patchwork of the old world, had no single soul. It was a quilt sewn from bishoprics and margraviates, from counts whose banners were older than the nations they touched. It was neither Holy France's friend, nor England's enemy. It was opportunity. Edward saw that opportunity, not in conquest, but in balance. If he could turn the lords of the Low Countries to his side, if he could tempt the emperor himself, he could force France to fight on two fronts, and stretch Philip thin. In 1338, he crossed the sea not as a warrior, but as a courtier, a traveller cloaked in royal blue, bearing coin chests heavy as tombs and flatteries sharper than blades. He entered the empire through Brabant, that wary duchy nestled between France and Germany, ruled then by Duke John III, a cautious man with clever eyes. Edward offered what kings always offer: protection, trade, marriage. He promised English wool to the cities of Bruges and Ghent, promised coin to the Dukes of Gelderland, Hainaut and Jülich. He painted France as a devourer, a greedy neighbor whose shadow would one day fall upon them all. The dukes listened, not because they loved him, but because war, even distant, grows interest like a banker's ledger. At the heart of this diplomatic weave stood the new Holy Roman Emperor, Ludwig IV of Bavaria, a man no stranger to conflict, for even His own crown had come with struggle. He too had tasted papal opposition, had warred with the Vatican and survived. And perhaps in Edward he saw a kindred soul, another monarch whose claim was questioned, whose authority trembled with divine uncertainty. In the chill of autumn 1338, beneath the high-vaulted ceilings of the imperial palace in Koblenz, Ludwig met Edward not just as sovereign to sovereign, but as political twin. And there, in candlelight and golden cloth, he gave Edward a gift, not of land, but of legitimacy. The Declaration of Koblenz was no war cry. It bore no blade, spilled no blood. But in its ink, everything changed. Ludwig proclaimed Edward the rightful king of France. It was an echo, one begun in Flanders by the merchants, now repeated in the imperial courts by the crowned. A gesture that stripped Philip VI of universal recognition and turned this war from rebellion into rivalry. The declaration did not carry divine judgment. The Pope, still leaning toward France, offered no blessing, but the politics of Europe had shifted, and Edward, once a claimant in the shadows, now stood in the light. Flush with German support, or at least the promise of it, Edward launched his next campaign. In 1339, he led a mixed army of English and Flemish forces into northern France, a slow and creaking machine of mercenaries, archers, and feudal knights. But this was not yet a war of sweeping victories. It was a march of hunger and hesitation. Castles closed their gates. Rivers turned muddy with autumn rain, and the French, aware of his movements, refused open battle. They knew what Edward wanted, a confrontation to legitimize his crown, so they denied it. The campaign ended not in triumph, but retreat. The winter was cruel. Supplies thinned, allies grew silent, and Edward, though crowned with recognition, remained a king without a battlefield. In England, murmurs stirred. The cost of diplomacy had drained the treasury. The Parliament grumbled under new taxes. The coins sent abroad returned only in promises. And in the shadows of court, some whispered that perhaps the claim to France was folly. But Edward did not bend. Because war, real war, is not won in weeks. It is a fire fed by patience, by persistence, by the long art of wearing the enemy down. He had not lost. He had only begun. What mattered was this. He had cracked the spell. France was no longer unchallenged. Its king had rivals. Its vassals had options. Its borders trembled not just from outside assault, but from the slow creep of doubt. That, too, was victory. A seed planted. The emperor's smile had cost dearly, but it had bought Edward time. And in time he would raise again the longbow. In time he would sail again across the channel, and when he did, it would not be with whispers, it would be with thunder. So sleep now in the chambers of Koblenz. Hear the rustle of parchment over politics. Feel the cold breath of empire on the neck of a hungry king. For even in silence, the great war moves forward, not always with battles, but with crowns and with cloaks. While Edward's gaze was fixed upon the flickering flame of French crowns and imperial alliances far to the north, beneath skies heavy with mist and memory, another war stirred. Scotland, wild and relentless, sang a different song. A song of freedom, sharpened like the edge of a claymore, ringing from the hills and glens where kings were born in fire and forged in blood. For centuries, Scotland had resisted. The English king might wear many crowns, but the land beyond the Tweed had never truly bowed. When Edward II had stumbled through defeat and disgrace, the Scots had rallied. Now, with Edward III's focus drawn toward the south, the harp and hammer struck in concert. The year was 1338. The fields of Bannockburn, not yet a memory distant but still burning bright in Scottish hearts, whispered courage. The spirit of Robert the Bruce, that fierce lion who had torn the chains of English rule, seemed to awaken in the rolling hills. King David II, young and untested, stood as beacon. His crown was new, his throne unsteady, but his cause was old. The right to rule his land without the shadow of England's claim. Seizing the moment, the Scots launched raids across the northern border. They struck swiftly, small bands descending like storms on villages, castles, and English garrisons left thin by campaigns abroad. The clang of steel and the howl of battle echoed in the valleys, a stark reminder England's hold was far from certain. Edward III, caught between crowns and kingdoms, faced a new dilemma. To chase glory in France meant leaving the north vulnerable. Yet to turn his armies back was to risk losing the very ground beneath his feet. So, England was torn. While diplomats parleyed with emperors and knights marshaled for campaigns in Aquitaine, the Scots pressed on, their raids threading like rivers of fire through the northern marches. Villages burned, supplies were stolen. English lords found their lands ravaged, their men restless. In the shadowed forests of the borders, legends were born. Rangers and raiders, heroes and ghosts moving unseen beneath the ancient oaks. To the south, Edward could only watch. His treasury stretched thin, his nobility divided. He dispatched knights northward, gallant men in shining armor. But many found themselves lost in the tangled hills, ambushed or outmaneuvered by foes who knew every stone and hollow. The war in Scotland was not a war of pitched battles, but of endurance and attrition. A slow bleed, a war of shadows, and it tugged at England's heart. Yet in this hardship lay a lesson. For Edward, the struggles of the North underscored a truth as old as kingship itself. No crown could hold without the loyalty of its subjects. No kingdom could prosper while its borders bled. No ambition, however grand, could ignore the land beneath one's feet. So the harp's song, wild, haunting, unyielding, echoed beyond the borders of Scotland. It was a call to remember that war is never one-sided, never confined. It is a tapestry woven from many threads, from crowns and cloaks, but also from hillsides and hearths. As winter tightened its grip, the war in Scotland became a silent ache beneath Edward's campaigns. And far away, in the dark halls of castles and courts, men whispered of treaties and truces yet to come. But for now, the North held its breath, and the 100 Years' War, while roaring in the South, hummed a quieter, fiercer tune, the war of the harp and the hammer. So rest now beneath the ancient stars of Caledonia, hear the haunting melodies of a land that will not bend. Feel the cold steel of rebellion, and know this: the tides of war are many. They do not rise and fall by one voice alone, but by many. The dawn broke cold and sharp on August 26th, 1346. A grey sky stretched endless above the rolling fields near Crécy, where the blood of kings and peasants alike would soon soak the soil, turning earth to memory. Edward III stood beneath a pale sun, his armor glinting like a star fallen from heaven. Around him, his army, a patchwork of English archers, knights in shining mail, and Flemish foot soldiers, waited with a stillness that felt less like calm and more like the breath before a storm. Across the field, the French forces gathered in a tide of banners and war horses, a sea of color and clamor. Philip VI's army was vast, knights in heavy plate, cavalry galloping like thunder, crossbowmen ready to unleash death's sharp sting. The air hung thick with tension, the distant hum of war drums blending with the murmurs of prayers and whispered fears. To the men who stood there, sons of England, France and the continent beyond, this was no mere battle. It was a reckoning. For years, the claim to the French crown had simmered beneath diplomacy and skirmishes. Now it would erupt into the raw and ancient language of war. The English had learned their lessons well. They knew the soil, the skies, the wind. Their longbows, deadly and unyielding, had become the weapons of destiny. When the signal came, the ground erupted in a storm of arrows. Not a gale, but a tempest, millions of shafts cutting through the air, whispering death. French knights charged, their horses screaming, their lances poised like spears of fate. But before they could reach the English lines, the sky itself seemed to fall upon them. Arrows found flesh and steel alike, unrelenting and precise. The mighty cavalry faltered. Shields splintered, helmets shattered. The battlefield became a shadowed tapestry of falling men and flying steel. Philip's army, though vast, was slowed by its own weight and pride. Heavy armor trapped them, and the mud beneath Crecy's fields became a snare. Yet the French pressed on, their cries rising over the thunder of hooves and the clang of swords. But Edward, calm as a storm's eye, held his ground. His archers, positioned behind stakes driven into the earth, let loose again and again. The arrows, blackening the sky, sang a song of survival and dominance. Among the chaos, legends took shape. The blind King John of Bohemia rode into battle, guided by his knights, a figure of noble sacrifice. He charged headlong into the fray, not knowing where arrows flew, but knowing where his honor lay. He would fall that day, a martyr beneath the hail of arrows, forever etched in history's shadows. By evening, the fields of Crecy were soaked with blood and silence. The French had been broken, their pride shattered beneath the relentless storm. Edward's victory was not just of arms, but of will, a testament to the power of innovation, patience, and quiet resolve. The battle changed the course of the war. It marked the dawn of a new kind of warfare, where foot soldiers could topple knights and where strategy outshone mere strength. But beneath the triumph lay a deeper truth, that war is not merely a contest of men and weapons, but of time and fate, of shadows and light. So close your eyes and listen to the whispering wind over Crecy's fields. Hear the distant rattle of arrows, the clash of steel, the silence that follows. And remember, even in the darkest storms, there is a calm that guides the way. The sea whispered against the stone walls of Calais, a city caught between tides of salt and war, between the dreams of kings and the endurance of its people. The year was 1347, and Edward III's gaze had turned once more from the open field to the stubborn fortress that guarded the Channel's narrow gate. Calais was more than stone and mortar. It was a prize, a jewel in the crown of commerce and conquest. To hold it was to command the doorway to France, to choke its ports and sway its destiny. Edward's army arrived heavy with siege engines, with banners flapping like dark wings in the coastal breeze. They came not as conquerors, hungry for battle, but as patient watchers. For this was a war of waiting, where hunger and time would become weapons, sharper than any sword. The city's walls stood proud, thick with centuries of defiance. Within, the citizens and soldiers braced for the long siege, knowing that their fate lay not only in the strength of their walls, but in their spirit. Days slipped into weeks, and weeks into months. The English encircled Calais like a tightening noose. Food grew scarce. Fear grew louder. Within the city, mothers whispered prayers. Children clung to stories of heroes long dead, and soldiers counted the days as if each might be their last. Outside, Edward's men stood firm, watchful shadows against the horizon, waiting for the walls to crumble not by force, but by the slow hunger gnawing inside. As the siege dragged on, something fragile and fierce emerged. A test of honor between foes locked in silent struggle. It was told that 6 noblemen of Calais, faces pale but unbroken, offered themselves to Edward as ransom, willing to sacrifice all to spare their city's soul. Clad in sackcloth, barefoot, their hands bound, they walked through the English camp, ghosts of courage against the dying light. Edward, moved by their sacrifice yet bound by duty, wavered. For in that moment, the war was no longer about land or crown. It was about humanity. But it was also about power. For the siege continued, relentless and unyielding. Calais starved, the walls weakened, until finally the gates opened, and Edward entered, not as a tyrant, but as a master of a city claimed by endurance, by hunger, by honor. The fall of Calais marked a turning point, a fortress gained, a foothold in enemy lands. But it was more than that. It was a lesson in patience, in sacrifice, in the slow, grinding heart of war. For war is not only fought with swords and shields, it is fought in silence, in waiting, in the quiet moments when hope flickers and only the strongest spirits remain. So rest now beneath the cold stones of Calais. Feel the weight of time and hunger. Hear the soft footsteps of sacrifice echoing through history, and know that even in the darkest sieges, honor can shine like a candle in the night. The drums of war beat softer now, but not because the war had ended. Rather, it had grown colder, more deliberate, less a wildfire, more a slow, consuming frost. And from within the mists of this long, bitter storm, a figure emerged on horseback. The Black Prince. He was not yet called that, not by his father, nor by the annalists who inked history by candlelight. To them, he was Edward of Woodstock, Prince of Wales, son of the English king, a boy commander wrapped in steel and destiny. But time would name him otherwise, and time remembers differently. He was just 16 when he first held command in war. A prince raised on the breath of legend, cradled by tapestries of Arthur and the saints. Yet there was steel in his eyes, and silence in his manner, and when he rode, men followed. His armor was polished black, a gleam of dusk beneath banners of gold and crimson. Whether that darkness was metaphor or metal, none can say for certain. But it suited him. In a war lit by fire and ambition, he was the shadow in its flame. It was in 1346 at the Battle of Crécy that his name first rang through France like a distant bell. There, with his father watching from a nearby ridge, the young prince stood at the heart of the English line, holding ground against wave after wave of French assault. At one point, as the fighting grew thick and desperate, a messenger was sent to Edward III, urging him to reinforce his son's line. The king is said to have replied, "Let the boy earn his spurs." And so he did, with blood, with breath, with brilliance. He did not flinch, he did not falter. And when the day was done and the French lay broken across the fields, Edward, not yet a man by age, had become won by fire. Now, in the years that followed, the prince rose higher, not merely as heir, but as hammer. In 1355, he rode again, this time into southern France, in a chevauchée that scorched the land from the Garonne to the Loire. It was not war in the old sense. It was devastation. Villages burned, towns were ransacked, crops were leveled underfoot. It was a campaign of terror, swift, brutal, deliberate, not out of cruelty, but calculation. The 100 Years' War was not only a war of battlefields, it was a war of hunger, of fear, of broken economies and burned granaries. The Black Prince understood this, and he wielded it. In 1356, near the town of Poitiers, his legend was sealed. He faced King John II of France, a mighty force of knights, banners waving, prayers whispered. The French outnumbered him 2-1, and their pride was high. But the prince held the field. He dismounted his knights. He set archers along the flanks, hedged by sharpened stakes, and he waited. When the French charged, they were met by volleys of longbow fire, sharp and unceasing. The battlefield became a cauldron of panic. Horses reared. Men fell. Then the English countercharged. Among the wreckage, the Black Prince fought not as a distant royal, but shoulder to shoulder with his men. His sword carved arcs in the chaos, and his voice, calm and firm, carried through the bloody dusk. By day's end, the King of France had been captured. His sons had fled or been taken. The flower of French chivalry lay broken in the dust, and the prince, still only 26, had brought an entire monarchy to its knees. But glory carries a shadow, and the prince, though victorious, would never fully escape it. He returned to England beloved, draped in honor, but changed. The war had carved something out of him, some softness, some light. His body began to falter. Illness would cling to him in the years ahead, and the Black Prince, once a name of youthful glory, became a figure haunted by triumph, wearied by fate. Yet in memory he endures, in the hush of battlefield ghosts, in the rusted hilts found beneath French soil, in the quiet pride of men who fought and followed. The Black Prince rides still, not just in song or statue, but in the long echo of a war that shaped kingdoms. So close your eyes and listen to hoofbeats in the mist, to banners flapping in distant skies, to a boy on horseback, riding into legend. The winds over Gascony moved like ancient breath, cool and deliberate, stirring the banners above 1,000 tents. From the high plains and down into the valleys, a hush had settled. Not silence, but the stillness that comes before a name is carved into legend. Edward of Woodstock, Prince of Wales, was young, not yet 30, and yet already more myth than man. His armor gleamed black in the morning haze, not with the soot of age, but with purpose. It was said the sun avoided him, that the sky turned gray when he rode, and though many claimed the name Black Prince would come after his death, others whispered it had followed him from birth, as if fate had shaded him before he ever drew sword. He was the heir of Edward III, born into prophecy and pageant. But in war, he earned nothing through birthright. It was through fire, real fire, that he forged his renown. He had stood at Crécy in 1346, just 16, when the sky fell dark with arrows and the ground broke beneath the charge of the French. His father had watched from a hill above, refusing to intervene. "Let the boy win his spurs," Edward III had said. And so he had. By dusk, the lad had become a warrior, no longer cloaked in the softness of youth, but burnished with the weight of iron, death, and duty. Now, years later, the prince had returned. This time, not a boy under command, but a commander in his own right. In 1355, he led a chevauchée, a fast, punishing raid, deep into southern France. Not to capture, not to hold, but to starve. Towns were burned, wheat fields razed, villages abandoned in terror. It was not cruelty, though cruelty followed. It was strategy. The Black Prince knew the war was not only won on battlefields, but in bellies and barns, in fear and fatigue. He struck not at armies, but at France's roots, its ability to feed and fund itself, and all the while he rode silent and unflinching. Not for conquest, not for vengeance, but because the weight of his father's crown, not yet his, pressed like iron on his chest. In 1356, the tide turned again. At Poitiers, Edward's army was smaller, outnumbered by thousands. Before him stood King John II of France, resplendent, resolved, wrapped in the old glory of chivalry. But the Black Prince had learned from the longbow, from the hills and hedges, from silence and suddenness. He set his men in a defensive line, narrow and steep, protected by spikes and forest. His archers lined the flanks. Not noblemen, not knights, but yeomen, trained to strike the sky and let it fall. When the French charged, the arrows sang, a rain of iron, wings of death. The French knights buckled, chaos spiraled, then Edward struck, not with elegance, but with quiet calculation. By sunset, King John had surrendered. The French crown was in chains. Nobles littered the field, bloodied and broken. The flower of France's knighthood had withered in a single day. Edward treated the captured king with honor, offering him velvet instead of ropes, respect instead of chains. It was not mockery. It was understanding. Even warriors wore masks, and those who wore them best rarely needed to speak. The Black Prince returned to England as a hero. Not just victorious, but luminous. He had broken a kingdom. He had held his nerve where others would have broken. Yet something in him had changed. The campaigns had worn deep ruts in his soul. His health began to fail. Some said it was dysentery. Others said it was the curse of power or the weight of legacy. Perhaps he had seen too much. Or perhaps he had seen too clearly. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. The brightness around him dimmed as if the black of his armor had crept inward. Still, he remained loyal to his father and to his duty. He governed Aquitaine for a time, tried to hold it, but war, taxes, and rebellion chipped at the edges of everything he'd won. By the time he died in 1376, at just 45, he was no longer the dazzling prince on horseback. He was a shadow of that youth, but the shadow was longer than the light. The name Black Prince did not fade. It deepened. It settled into the soil, into song, into the blood of those who would fight under his memory. To the French, he was a phantom of dread. To the English, a symbol of what might have been. To history, he remained suspended, somewhere between boy and myth, steel and silence. So let the world quiet now, hear the hoofbeats in the night fog, see the flicker of a black helm under a cold moon. And know this, some legends are not born. They ride out again and again across time. The wind that once carried arrows now carried parchment. The clang of sword had given way, if only briefly, to the slow scratch of a quill across vellum. After decades of siege and scorched harvest, of kings in chains and princes turned to shadow, a hush had fallen across the kingdoms. Not silence, not yet, but something like it. A lull, wide and uneasy, like the breath a forest takes before lightning strikes again. This was 1360, the year the world tried, however briefly, to hold its fire. This was the year of the Treaty of Bretigny, a fragile ink-drawn armistice carved not in marble or memory, but in soot, and like soot, it would not hold. The war by now had left both kingdoms fraying. France, once the proud heart of Christendom, had been gutted, its king captured at Poitiers, its countryside burned to husks, its nobles ransomed into ruin. And England, though victorious in arms, bore wounds of its own, empty coffers, restive lords, and a prince, the Black Prince, who had returned not triumphant, but weary and ill. Both nations bled quietly behind their banners. So they met, not out of trust, but necessity. They met at Bretigny, near Chartres, under grey skies and guarded eyes. And there, a treaty was born. Edward III agreed, in gesture if not heart, to renounce his claim to the French crown. It was a lie, but a useful one. In exchange, the English king was granted sovereignty over vast swaths of France, Gascony, Calais, Poitou, and more. Not as a vassal to France, but as an independent monarch. The land was his, not held in fealty, but ruled outright. It was an astonishing concession. France, broken and humiliated, had given away a third of its body to save the rest of its soul. In return, England would release King John II, still held captive in London, his crown grown heavier with every passing day in exile. The terms were signed, hands were shaken reluctantly, and history paused. But treaties, like glass, crack where they are thinnest. The ink had barely dried when both sides began to strain against the words. Edward delayed his renunciations. France balked at payments. The lands, those ancient sacred battlegrounds between kings, remained restless. In truth, the war had not ended. It had only knelt, and even in kneeling, it had one hand on the hilt. For a moment, though, the world imagined peace. In London, bells rang softly. In Paris, people dared to rebuild. Children were born who knew neither siege nor flight, if only for a season. But behind the treaties, behind the smiles, the soil remembered, and the knights, those strange holy beasts of the age, sharpened their swords in private. Even the Black Prince, his body failing in quiet decay, returned to Aquitaine, to govern, to tax, to rule in the name of a father who still dreamed of golden lions on the French throne. He found no peace there. The French peasants hated the English yoke. The French nobles hated it more. And behind every coin taxed and every oath sworn, resentment fermented like old wine in a cracked barrel. By 1369, the pretense collapsed. France, under the cunning hand of Charles V, son of the once imprisoned John, refused to let Edward's grip remain uncontested. He reclaimed lands, he rekindled war, and once more the English banners fluttered not as guests, but as invaders. The Treaty of Bretigny, for all its grand clauses and ceremonious seals, had lasted less than a decade. Its promises, now ash. Yet its meaning lingers. Not in borders, for borders shift like riverbeds, but in the shape of things to come. Bretigny was a hinge. The war before it was chivalric, bright with banners, bold with charges, knight against knight. The war after was something else, quieter, crueler, filled with skirmish and siege, more desperate than divine. It marked the end of belief in clean victories, and it marked the rise of something darker, the idea that peace, once broken, becomes harder to believe in than war. So listen now to the sound of a scroll being unrolled in an empty chamber, to the voice of a scribe reading clauses he does not trust, to the wind passing through a hall where peace once sat, briefly, like a guest who knew it would not be invited back. Then sleep gently with this thought. Not all truces are lies, but most are pauses. And in this long war of kings and kingdoms, even the pauses wear armor. There is a silence that follows broken vows. It does not echo. It sinks. Down into stone, down into hearts that once beat in rhythm with banners, down into the sacred idea of chivalry, now coughing in the dark. By the time the Treaty of Bretigny collapsed in the waning 1360s, something more profound had begun to rot than merely agreements. An age, once steeped in ceremony, honor, and bright steel, began to sag under the weight of its own contradictions. The war had returned. But the war that came back was no longer wrapped in pageantry. It had claws now, and the claws were caked in mud. France, like a field long scorched, had sprouted something strange in the ashes. Charles V, son of the captured king, did not wear his crown with the blinding splendor of his forebears. He did not ride out in gleaming armor or chase battlefield glory. Instead, he studied, he waited, he whispered, and he built his war like a spider builds a web, slowly, deliberately, invisible to the proud. They called him Charles the Wise, and wisdom, it seemed, had replaced gallantry. He revived the French monarchy not through gallant charges, but through tactics, patience, and subtle betrayal. He turned away from chivalric warfare and embraced attrition, the slow, grinding collapse of enemy will. He appointed a man unlike any France had seen before, Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton of low birth, dark complexion, and unmatched cunning. Not a courtly knight, but a ghost in armor. He fought not for honor, but for survival, for country, and for vengeance against humiliation. Du Guesclin did not wait for trumpet calls. He struck at night. He wore no finery. He retreated when outnumbered. He attacked supply lines, isolated castles, and weary convoys. And he won. Meanwhile, the English war machine, once unstoppable, began to stagger. The Black Prince, once the sword of his nation, grew sick in body and spirit. In Aquitaine, he imposed crushing taxes to fund his campaigns. And when rebellion broke out in Limoges, he responded with fire. The sack of Limoges in 1370 became a wound that would never close. Thousands were said to have died, civilians, women, children. Even then, some English chroniclers tried to veil it in glory, but the myth was fading, and beneath it, the Black Prince was dying. His strength ebbed with every month. He could no longer ride. He returned to England, a pale shadow, and died in 1376. The once shining heir of England's golden victories was buried not as a conqueror, but as a fallen star. With him died the last breath of the old chivalric war, and France began to rise. Charles V reclaimed nearly all the territories lost after Bretigny, not with grand battles, but with sieges, blockades, and relentless diplomacy. One by one, the English strongholds in Normandy, Brittany, and Poitou fell. The lion that had once roared across the Channel was now wounded, cornered, and roaring mostly at ghosts. And in the shadows, the old codes of warfare, ransom, honor, mercy, were being rewritten in blood. A new cruelty had entered the war. No longer did noblemen pause the fight to save their equals. No longer were prisoners always spared for ransom. Now, entire towns were executed. Now, betrayal crept even into peace talks. Mercenaries, called free companies, swarmed the countryside, loyal to coin, not country. They looted in the name of no one, burned abbeys for bread, and sold their swords like blacksmiths sold nails. They were knights without cause, kings without crowns, the children of a broken age. And yet, in this twilight of ideals, something true emerged. The idea that war would never again be clean. That kings were not always noble. That courage could look like retreat, and that survival was sometimes the greatest act of heroism. The 100 Years' War, by its middle years, had become a mirror, and what it reflected was not glory, but us, our ambitions, our lies, our endless hunger. In 1377, Edward III died, old, nearly blind, and disillusioned. The warrior king who had dreamed of 2 crowns was buried with only 1. His grandson, a child of 10, became Richard II, a boy king for a kingdom grown weary. And thus, a new chapter began, not with a charge, but with a whimper, The dragon's fire had dimmed, and only smoke remained. So let the sky dim now, let the gold on the night's shoulders rust, let the songs of old glory fade into whispers among the hedgerows, and let the world sleep, knowing this: chivalry is not eternal. It was a dream, a beautiful one. But even dreams break beneath the weight of years. The wind over England in the year 1377 did not cheer for a new king. It sighed. It moved across the windows of Westminster, through cathedral towers and peasant fields, rustling tapestries and thatched roofs alike, not in celebration, but in quiet apprehension. For the lion had grown old and died, and now a lamb wore its mane. Richard II, 10 years old, was crowned amidst incense and gold, his head bowed not in humility, but in confusion. He wore the crown of Edward III, a relic too heavy for his neck, too ancient for his youth. And in that moment, England, victorious, proud, battle-worn, became something fragile, a realm ruled by whispers, counselors, and the tremble of a child's breath. He was no ordinary boy, this Richard. He spoke with grace, walked with princely bearing, and bore himself like one touched by divine light. But behind his silvered manner was the heart of one born not in fire, but in fear. His father, the Black Prince, had died too early, his kingdom too deeply mired in debt and loss. And though his uncles, John of Gaunt chief among them, sought to guide the crown, they too were men of ambition cloaked in duty. It was not a reign at first, it was a balancing act, a child upon the throne, a council of nobles upon the purse, and the people, restless, taxed, ignored, upon the edge of revolt. For the war, though quiet on the fields, had bled the land dry. Coin was needed to feed the machine, and coin, by royal decree, would be taken, not from the rich, but from the many. So the poll tax was born, a levy on every soul, from lord to serf, to pay for battles not fought and honor not restored. 3 times it was raised, and on the 3rd, in 1381, England broke. It began in Essex and Kent, in the fields, in the inns, in the corners of every town where rumors festered like mold in damp stone. Common folk began to murmur, "Why do we pay for the sins of kings? Why do we bleed while lords feast? Are we not sons of God too?" It grew, first to marches, then to mobs. Thousands descended upon London like a river long held back. They were not disorganized brutes. They carried banners. They carried demands. They were led by men like Wat Tyler, bold, unyielding, a voice for those who had none. They called it revolt, but in their hearts they called it justice. They broke into prisons. They beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury. They stormed the Tower of London. For days the city was theirs, not for loot, but for change. And into this storm walked the boy king. He met them at Smithfield, amidst smoke and fury, not from atop a horse of gold, but as one who knew he might die. Wat Tyler spoke his truth. Then he was struck down, by treachery, by sword, by fear. The crowd roared, but Richard, with a voice he did not know he had, raised his hand. "I am your captain now," he said. "I will be your king." And for a moment they believed him. The crowd dispersed, the city calmed, and the child was hailed as a savior. But words, like treaties, do not hold long when spoken by those who fear their own court. In the days that followed, Richard's promises to the rebels were revoked. Land was not freed. Lords were not punished, and one by one the peasant leaders were hunted, hanged, forgotten. The crown endured. But its innocence was gone. Richard, shaped by fire, grew into a king unlike his ancestors. He did not hunger for war, he hungered for order, for majesty, for reverence, for a kingdom that bowed not just to sword, but to image. He believed he was anointed, chosen by God not merely to reign, but to be adored. He surrounded himself with flatterers. He dismissed his uncles. He ruled not as steward of a battered realm, but as an artist of power. And England, already fraying at the seams, began to pull further apart. The war with France resumed in flickers, but Richard sought peace. In 1396, he signed a 28-year truce with Charles VI of France, even marrying the French king's daughter, Isabella, a girl of just 7. It was a gesture of diplomacy. But to his lords, it reeked of weakness. The fire that had once united crown and noble now flickered uncertainly, casting long, suspicious shadows. In those shadows stood Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, a cousin, an exile, and one who watched Richard's divine vanity with growing resentment. By 1399, while Richard travelled in Ireland, Bolingbroke returned to England. He did not claim rebellion. He claimed justice, the restoration of lands the king had seized, but what he claimed, he took. And when Richard returned, he found the crown had slipped. He was imprisoned. He was forced to abdicate. And before winter's end, Richard II was dead. Perhaps by starvation, perhaps by murder, perhaps by the quiet cruelty of being forgotten. Thus ended the boy king's story, not in glory, but in a slow unraveling of ideals, and the crown, once a circle of gold upon the head of a child, passed to Henry IV. A new dynasty was born, a Lancaster on the throne, and the war, silent for a moment, stirred once more. So sleep now, listener, in the hush between reigns, and remember, a boy upon a throne is not always a blessing, and a king without trust is merely a child in armor. The crown, heavy and worn, passed quietly into new hands. No fanfare greeted Henry Bolingbroke when he became Henry IV in 1399. No songs rang through the halls of Westminster. No crowds thronged the streets in jubilation. Instead, a kingdom held its breath. Henry was a man shaped by exile and bitter resolve. Born of the powerful House of Lancaster, he carried the weight of both ambition and grievance. His father, John of Gaunt, had been a pillar of the old regime, a guardian of the realm and the king's loyal brother. But loyalty, as the years revealed, was a fragile thread. When Richard II took the throne, Henry found himself cast aside, stripped of lands and titles. Exile was his punishment, yet exile became his forge. In distant courts and shadowed halls, he planned, he gathered allies, and he waited for the moment the throne would call him home. That moment came when Richard, his once favored cousin, faltered. Henry returned to England with the quiet assurance of inevitability. The nobles who had once supported Richard switched their banners. The common folk, weary of chaos, sought stability, and the crown, slipping like sand through fingers, found its new master. But Henry's reign was not a herald of peace. The wounds of war had not healed. They had only deepened. England remained a land fractured, its people divided by loyalties old and new. The House of York watched, silent but vigilant. The memory of the Black Prince and Richard II lingered like ghosts in every hall. Abroad, France was no less restless. The country still bore the scars of the war's long shadow. Though Charles VI, the Mad King, sat upon the French throne, real power rested in the hands of ambitious nobles. Among them, the Duke of Burgundy and the Armagnac faction fought bitterly for influence, their rivalry a dagger poised over the kingdom's heart. Into this fractured world stepped a figure destined to change the course of history. Henry V, the son of Henry IV, a warrior and a king forged in the fires of conflict. He inherited a kingdom hungry for glory and a war that had smoldered in the background. Henry V would not be content with truce and fragile peace. He sought conquest. In 1415, the young king led his army across the Channel. His destination was the fields of northern France, the ancient lands where kings had fought for centuries. The campaign would culminate in the fateful Battle of Agincourt. On that cold October day, outnumbered and outmatched, Henry's forces stood their ground against the French knights. The mud swallowed horses and men alike. The English longbow sang its deadly song, and a new chapter in the 100 Years' War was written in blood and valor. The victory at Agincourt was not merely a military triumph. It was a symbol, a moment when the tide seemed to turn, when the crown of England stretched again toward the dream of empire. But as with all dreams built on war, the shadows lengthened. The price of conquest was steep. The alliances forged were fragile, and the war, far from over, awaited its next turning. So rest now in the quiet between battles. Know that kings rise and fall, and empires are but fleeting whispers on the wind. Yet their stories endure, carried on the breath of time. The dawn broke cold and grey over the fields of northern France, a world soaked in mist and mud, where the earth itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of war. Here, on October 25th, 1415, beneath an iron sky, a small English army faced a vast French host, their banners fluttering like storm clouds ready to burst. They were the men of Henry V, weary, battered, outnumbered by many thousands. And yet, in that moment of silence before the storm, a quiet fire burned in their eyes. The fields around the village of Agincourt were narrow, hemmed by dense woods and churned with recent rain. The French knights, resplendent in shining armor, towered like living giants. Their horses pawed the earth, restless and proud. But the English archers, their long bows strung and ready, stood firm. Their weapons were simple wood and string, yet in their hands they became instruments of fate. The battle began with the thunder of horses and the clash of steel. The French charged forward, confident in their strength and numbers, but the ground was treacherous, slick with mud and bodies. Horses stumbled and fell, dragging knights into the mire. Arrows darkened the sky, whistling like death incarnate. The longbow, wielded by men who had trained since childhood, sang a deadly hymn. Its shafts pierced armor, found gaps in chainmail, and felled horses. The French lines faltered. Panic rippled through their ranks like wildfire. Amidst the chaos, Henry rode through his men, a beacon of resolve. He spoke not only with words, but with presence. A king forged in battle, embodying the spirit of a nation. His cry, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," would echo through history. When the dust settled, the field was strewn with the fallen. Thousands of French knights lay broken, their banners trampled. The English, though battered, had prevailed, a victory against overwhelming odds. Agincourt was more than a battle. It was a testament to the power of courage, strategy, and unyielding will. It marked the zenith of English might in the 100 Years' War. Yet, even in triumph, the seeds of future strife were sown. Henry's conquest pressed onward, but his reign was short. In 1422, at the age of 35, Henry V died. His dream of uniting England and France passed to his infant son, Henry VI. The war's endless cycle would continue, a dance of glory and despair, of kings and commoners caught in the tide of history. So now, rest gently as the echoes of Agincourt fade into the quiet night. Remember the longbow's song, the courage of those who stood against the storm, and the fragile flame of hope in a world of war. The war did not end with a victory. It turned inward. When Henry V died in 1422, the sword was still sharp, the banners still raised, but the hand that held the kingdom together had slipped quietly into the dark. He left behind no seasoned heir, no lion-hearted prince. Only a child, a babe swaddled in royal linen, Henry VI, not yet a year old. And so began a new kind of struggle. It was not a battle of swords, not at first, but of councils and courts, whispers and shadows, where men wore smiles like daggers and loyalty turned to dust in the presence of power. England was now a ship without a captain, tossed between noble ambition and continental storm. The boy king was crowned twice, once in Westminster Abbey as King of England, and once in the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris, declared King of France in the very heart of his rival's capital. It was a title gilded with illusion. For while Henry's name stretched across both thrones, the land beneath them cracked. In England, the regency passed between powerful uncles, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, fiery and impulsive, and John, Duke of Bedford, wise and weary, who took charge of the French war effort. Bedford, a soldier statesman, held the tide at bay, maintaining English control in northern France through diplomacy and force. But even his measured hand could not still the storm brewing in the French soul. For in the east of France, where the fields met the fog, a new voice began to rise. Not a noble, not a prince, but a girl, a shepherdess from Domremy, who said she heard the voice of God, Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. As England's nobles squabbled, as the infant king sat silent upon his gilded chair, Joan burned with purpose. She would lift the siege of Orléans. She would rally the demoralized French. She would crown the Dauphin, Charles VII, in Reims. And she would fracture the English myth of destiny, not with steel, but with fire and faith. For all their victories, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, the English now faced something older than chivalry and stronger than kings. They faced belief. Henry VI, when he grew into boyhood, was unlike his father. Where Henry V had been bold, Henry VI was gentle. Where his father had been a commander, the son was a contemplative, bookish, pious, withdrawn. There was a beauty to him, quiet, saintly, mournful. But in the brutal theater of empire, such softness was dangerous. France, once divided and despairing, found new unity, and England, once triumphant, began to unravel from within. The nobles grew restless, the treasury drained, and the boy king, now a young man, stood in the center of the storm, not with a sword, but with a prayer. Let the night remember him not as weak, but as human in a world that devoured gentleness. Let his story be a candle, flickering, trembling in the winds of war and fate. Sleep now in the hush between rains, for soon the peace will crumble, the tide will turn, and the war will return, not just to France, but to England's very heart. She came from the edge of nowhere, a village so small it was hardly on the maps. Domremy, nestled in the mist-veiled valleys of eastern France. There were no lords among her kin, no wealth, no lineage of war. only flocks and fields, prayers whispered to saints, and the distant drumbeat of battles she had never seen. Yet the voice that stirred inside her would not be ignored. Joan. She called herself Jeanne la Pucelle, Joan the Maiden. She was just a girl when the archangel spoke, or so she said. Michael, guardian of heaven, and Saints Catherine and Margaret, their voices warm as candlelight. They came with a charge, not small or simple. Drive out the English. Crown the true king. It was madness, and yet it moved mountains. In an age where kings doubted, this girl believed. Not in crowns or coins, but in visions, in France. And France, ragged and reeling, believed in her. She journeyed through a kingdom split by betrayal. Nobles called her heretic, clergy called her deluded. But the common folk, they saw something else, something holy, something beyond politics or war. In armor forged for a man, she rode like prophecy. Her banner flew not with lions or lilies, but with God's name written in gold. Orléans, the city under siege. The English had nearly strangled it, the last breath of French resistance trapped within its walls. Joan arrived not as a savior, but as a storm. In May 1429, she broke the siege. She led not by strategy, but by faith, charging forward where knights hesitated, shouting to soldiers who had forgotten what courage tasted like, and they followed. It was not just a victory, it was a resurrection. The French cause, once gasping, drew breath again. From there, she marched to Rheims, through territory still gnawed by English garrisons, and delivered the Dauphin to his crown. In the ancient cathedral, where kings had long been anointed, Charles VII became king in truth, his coronation watched by the girl who'd seen it all in vision. She had done what no army had done in decades, and yet she would not live to see peace. In May 1430, near Compiègne, she was captured by the Burgundians, allies of the English. They did not treat her as a prisoner of war. They treated her as a threat to the order of the world. A girl with visions, unlettered, untrained, had altered the course of a continent. That could not be allowed. The trial was cruel theater. Clerics demanded answers to questions designed to twist her. Her visions were called lies, her banner, blasphemy, her clothing, heresy. She stood alone. No army came for her. No king rode to her rescue. In Rouen, they lit the fire. She was 19. They bound her in the market square and raised the pyre. The smoke curled up like incense from a broken altar. And in the end, her last word was not for vengeance. It was for the divine. Jesus, she whispered as the flames took her. Ashes scattered on the Seine, but her memory, like the voices that first called to her, never faded. The war would rage on, the crowns would clash again, but something had changed. France had found its soul, not in a general, not in a prince, but in a shepherd girl who burned like a star and vanished. So now, sleep beneath the sky she once rode under. Let the wind carry her name. For though they silenced her voice, they could not silence her echo. It lingers in the fields, in the cathedrals, in every fire lit for freedom. History does not move like a river. It stumbles like a man in darkness, tripping over pride, falling on the sharp stones of memory, turning its blade not always against the enemy, but against its own kin. So it was with France. So it was with Burgundy. Once the Dukes of Burgundy had been princes of France. The blood of kings ran through their veins, their lands rich with wine and silver, their court a mirror of splendor that rivaled Paris itself. But what is family in the shadow of power? The great schism within France did not begin on a battlefield. It began in an alley. There, in 1407, under flickering torches and whispered treachery, Louis, Duke of Orléans, brother to the king, was murdered, struck down in the name of order, by men loyal to John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. What followed was not justice, it was unraveling. The realm divided as if cleaved by the assassin's blade. The Armagnacs, loyal to Orléans and the royal family. The Burgundians, claiming order, but walking with English steel. John the Fearless played a deadly game. He sided with no one and everyone. He met with the Dauphin, Charles, the future king who wandered through war like a ghost. And at Montereau, beneath a truce, he was struck down. By the very hand he had reached out to shake, another dagger, another alley. Then came Philip the Good, John's son, cloaked not in fear, but ambition. He would not forgive. He turned his back on France and opened his gates to England. With Burgundy's might behind them, the English pressed deeper. Paris fell. Northern France became a patchwork of oaths and broken loyalties. It was no longer England versus France. It was France against itself, and from that fracture, England harvested triumph. Henry V, in his brief reign, had brokered an impossible peace. Through the Treaty of Troyes, the French king, mad and hollowed by years of decline, named Henry as heir, disinheriting his own son, Charles. But this treaty was born of war, not truth. And war, like fire, does not hold treaties in reverence. After Henry V's death, his infant son was crowned Henry VI of both realms. But he was a king in name only, a child shadowed by his father's ghosts, by the burning memory of Joan, and by the duplicity of Burgundy's court. Philip the Good ruled like a sovereign. His court in Dijon became a beacon of art and power. He amassed land, wealth, and influence, and played both crowns like a master of puppets. But power cannot sit upon two chairs. And as Charles VII began to reclaim his kingdom piece by piece, Philip too felt the shifting winds. Eventually, even Burgundy would find the cost of betrayal too steep. The English grew weaker, their foothold narrowed, and Philip began to look not toward London, but toward Paris, toward reconciliation, toward survival. Yet, for decades, it was his betrayal, his alliance with England, that prolonged the war, that deepened the wound between brothers. The 100 Years' War was not fought only with swords. It was fought with marriages, with assassinations, with parchment and poisoned cups, and with the quiet, cold treason of a man who called himself cousin. Sleep now, in this hour of fractured loyalties. Rest in the knowledge that even in war, blood remembers blood. And though kingdoms fall and friends become foes, there is always the quiet ache of return, waiting just beyond the firelight. To understand the soul of the 100 Years' War, one must look not only to crowns, nor to cities of stone, but to the dust roads that snake through vineyards, to the sun-baked hills of the south, to Gascony. For there, in lands older than memory, where Roman roads still lingered like buried veins, France and England clashed not just for thrones, but for identity. Gascony had long been a paradox. Though it lay in France, it had pledged itself to English kings for generations. Its people, Gascons, were fiercely local, their loyalties neither simple nor pure. They drank English wine and wore French silks. They prayed in Latin and fought in dialect, and when war came to their door, it split them in half. Brother against brother, vineyard against vineyard. In the early years, Gascony had been England's jewel. Edward III had treated it not as a frontier, but as a birthright. A land won through Eleanor of Aquitaine, a land that breathed with his ancestors' bones. But the war dragged on. Fortresses changed hands. Knights grew old, and kings grew tired. By the mid-15th century, the tide had turned. France, once fractured by civil war and riddled with doubt, was beginning to rise from its knees, and Gascony, once England's outpost of strength, became a shadowed land, a place of sieges, of whispers, of the slow tightening of the French noose. It began in earnest in 1451, when Charles VII, newly strengthened by Joan's legacy and Burgundy's softening allegiance, turned his gaze south. He did not come in wrath. He came in strategy. City by city, the French king reclaimed the region. Bordeaux, the crown of the duchy, held on with a desperate, wavering loyalty to England. Its merchants feared the loss of English markets. Its nobles clung to old pacts and older myths. But war does not ask permission. It only advances. French troops, trained in new discipline, led by commanders, sharpened by years of attrition, pressed into Gascon soil. In July of 1451, Bordeaux surrendered. Soon after, Bayonne, the last English foothold in all of southern France, fell. It was not just a defeat, it was an extinction. Gascony, held by England for over 3 centuries, was gone. What had once been a thread tying England to the continent had frayed and snapped. The wine trade, the land holdings, the ancient treaties, all turned to ash. But England was not yet finished. From across the sea, still mourning the death of its champions, still struggling under a child king and a court of rival factions, it prepared a final answer. And in 1452, John Talbot, the aging lion of English war, landed once more. At first, the people of Bordeaux welcomed him. He brought hope wrapped in banners, memories of the old days when English ships filled the harbors and Gascony drank deeply from northern trade. But this return was not a restoration. It was a final chapter. For France, already steadying its foundations, would not allow the past to be resurrected. The stage was set for the final clash, the Battle of Castillon, a battlefield where the last embers of England's hopes would be snuffed out, but that would come next. Tonight, rest beneath the southern stars, where olive trees whisper in the wind, and where the war, for a moment, grew quiet. Sleep in the memory of a land divided, where loyalties once flowed like rivers, but now run dry. Some wars end with treaties, some with coronations, with parchment or quiet nods across polished tables. But the 100 Years' War, this long, bitter haunting, did not end with a whisper. It ended with the thunder of cannon, with the fall of a hero, with the silence that follows when the last lion dies. It was 1453, a year etched not in triumph but in exhaustion. England, still ruled by the childlike Henry VI, torn by court factions and whispers of madness, could no longer sustain the fantasy of empire. But fantasy is stubborn, and it has claws, and so they sent him. John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, the old warhound of England, his armor dented by decades, his name spoken with reverence from Agincourt to Rouen. He was not a man for the age of artillery. He was a knight of banners and charges, a remnant of chivalry in an age now ruled by powder and shot. Talbot landed in Gascony like a storm remembered. With fire, speed, and the applause of Bordeaux, who opened her gates once more to the English flag, still dreaming of a time when ships from London filled her docks. But across the Garonne River, France was not idle. Jean Bureau, master of artillery, waited near a village named Castillon, with trenches dug deep and cannons arranged like a choir of thunder. This would not be a night's war. This would be geometry and fire. Talbot, impatient and proud, advanced without his full army. He believed he had caught the French mid-retreat, but it was a ruse. Bureau had not fled, he had fortified. And as Talbot's cavalry charged through dust and sunlight, the ground erupted beneath them. Cannons fired not in volley, but in rhythm, a language of metal and smoke that sang the death song of the mounted knight. Talbot's horse was struck. He fell beneath its weight. His armor, glorious and gleaming, became his tomb. And there, amidst the din of collapse, the last great English general in France was slain. By his side, his son, young, noble, doomed, fell too. A father and son, one legacy, buried in foreign soil. The Battle of Castillon lasted hours, but its echo would ring for centuries. France had learned how to win not with glory, but with discipline. England had learned too late that banners could not stop cannonballs. The loss broke more than lines. It broke illusions. The myth of English dominance shattered. The last dream of Gascony extinguished. When Bordeaux fell once more, it did not rise again. The English were driven from every inch of French soil, save for the wind-blown outpost of Calais, and even that would, in time, be taken. But Castillon was more than a battlefield. It was a funeral for a century of war, for the age of the longbow, for the days when kings rode beside their men and war still wore the mask of chivalry. And yet, as the smoke lifted, something else was born. Not peace, not yet, but the possibility of it. France, scarred but whole, would begin to stitch together her wounds. Her fields, long soaked in blood, would begin to green again, and England, returned across the Channel, would turn inward, toward a storm called the Wars of the Roses. But that is another night's tale. Tonight, we bury Talbot beneath Gascon stars. We fold the banner, we sheathe the sword, let the cannons fall silent, let the soil cool. The 100 Years' War has spoken its last roar, and in the stillness that follows, a nation wakes and another dreams. Long after the cannons fell silent at Castillon, and the banners of England retreated beyond the sea, the breath of the 100 Years' War lingered, not in armies nor in castles, but in the whispered legend of a girl. She was born of peasant soil, of village prayers and simple songs, yet the flame she carried was no ordinary spark. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, who heard the voices of saints and carried a sword, blessed by heaven itself. Her story is stitched with light and shadow, a tapestry woven from the threads of faith, courage, and sacrifice. She appeared when France was broken, when the crown teetered on ruin, when despair lay thick as winter frost. In 1429, Joan crossed the fields near the Loire, her armor shining, her banner fluttering like a promise. She led the French to break the siege of Orleans, a moment suspended in time where hope returned with the cry of trumpets and the clash of steel. Her presence was not just of war, but of myth. She was a living paradox, a girl and a warrior, a voice and a silence, a flame that burned bright yet did not consume herself. But legend is a fragile thing, captured by the Burgundians, sold to the English. She was tried and condemned. The fire that once blazed on battlefields now flickered in a prison cell. On a cold day in 1431, in the shadow of Rouen great cathedral, Joan was led to the stake. The flames rose like a cruel sun, and as she burned, she became more than a woman. She became a symbol. Her death did not extinguish the war, but it seeded something far greater, the unyielding spirit of France itself. Through centuries, her voice has echoed, in the quiet corners of churches, in the songs of peasants, in the hearts of those who dare to hope against impossible odds. Joan's flame, though quenched in fire, continues to burn in the soul of a nation, a reminder that even in darkness, the light of courage and faith may never die. So, rest now beneath the stars that watched her fall. Let her spirit whisper you to sleep, a lullaby of faith and fire, of a girl who dared to change the course of history with nothing but a sword and a voice. In the long shadow of war's devastation, when the land was scorched and the people weary, a man emerged from obscurity, a king whose crown was heavy with doubt and destiny. Charles VII, the Dauphin of France, once mocked as the King of Bourges. His reign began in exile, a crown unrecognized, a throne contested. He was not born a hero, not graced by glory or legend, but by perseverance. The slow, steady hand of a ruler who learned to claim his birthright not through force, but through the quiet strength of hope. The tale of Charles is a journey through darkness, from the halls of despair to the dawn of renewal. At his side rose Joan of Arc, the maid whose fire rekindled the hearts of men, leading them through the gates of Orléans, a turning point etched forever in the stones of history. With each victory, the shadow of his kingship grew, and with it, the unity of a fractured France. No longer a scattered collection of fiefs, but a kingdom knitting itself together, thread by thread, vow by vow, against the tide of foreign rule. Charles learned the art of rule in fire, tempered by betrayal, fortified by resolve. He rebuilt his court, restored the treasury, and summoned lords and peasants alike to swear fealty to a France reborn. The crown that once seemed a fragile illusion now gleamed with a steady light. By the time the English faltered in Gascony, Charles's reign had taken root. His voice, once drowned in whispers, now carried across the land like a clarion call. And yet the war was not over. The wound still ran deep, the scars of battle etched into the earth and the hearts of its people. But with Charles on the throne, a new chapter began, one of hope, resilience, and the slow weaving of peace. So sleep, now beneath the quiet sky, knowing that even in the darkest night, the dawn waits patiently to rise. The crown is heavy, yes, but it is worn by those who dare to believe. The war, after so many decades, wore thin like ancient parchment, frayed at the edges, its stories fading into the dust of time. The final years crept forward, a slow, measured descent toward the end of a conflict that had carved its name deep into the bones of two nations. France had grown stronger, its fields richer, its people steadier, but the echoes of the past still whispered on the wind. English flags still flew in stubborn pockets, and the sea was a thin, trembling line of hope and loss. In 1450, the tide turned at the Battle of Formigny, a clash not of swords alone, but of innovation, where French artillery thundered louder than the cries of knights, breaking the last holds of English power in Normandy. The English, weary and fractured, fought on with dwindling strength, but the spark was fading. The great names that once ruled the battlefield had fallen or turned their gaze elsewhere. Toward the tangled web of their own politics, the rising storm of civil war back home. In France, Charles VII's hand steadied the realm, yet the cost was a land scarred, a people weary but unbroken. As castles fell and flags were lowered, the dream of English conquest slipped away like a candle guttering in a winter draught. By 1453, the final blow came at Castillon, the cannon's roar sealing the fate of a century of war. Calais remained the last English outpost, a fading star soon to be extinguished. The war had ended, but its legacy was complex and deep, a shifting of power, a rebirth of nations, and a reminder that even the longest night must give way to dawn. Sleep now, beneath the quiet skies. Let the whispers of these twilight years lull you toward peace, as history's slow breath begins to still. When the swords were finally sheathed and the banners lowered into silence, what remained was not triumph, but a wounded land and the breathless hush of grief that follows every storm. The 100 Years' War had ended, but the soil of France still trembled beneath the memory of hoofbeats. Villages once scorched by fire now stood in ruins. Church bells rang again, yet their music was somber, echoing through hollow fields and half-built homes. It was not a piece of celebration, but a piece of exhaustion, a sigh across generations, of sons buried far from home, of fields left fallow, of mothers and widows waiting for voices that would never return. France, slowly, began to breathe again. Under Charles VII, the fractured realm drew itself inward, like a body learning to mend its bones. He expelled the last of the mercenaries, reclaimed the crown's dignity, and began a quiet reconstruction, not of glory, but of foundations. Stone by stone, bridges were rebuilt, markets reopened, and the chimes of language and trade returned to towns where once there had only been crows and fire. The nobility, once so drunk on war, began to settle, their swords resting beneath coats of arms now dusted with peacetime rust. But the scars endured. Entire generations had known only war, young men raised on stories of siege, old men who could no longer remember peace. The church, too, had been shaken. Joan's martyrdom lingered as a sacred wound. A century later, she would be made a saint. But in this fragile hour, her memory hovered like incense over the conscience of a kingdom. And what of England? A kingdom that once dreamed of empire, now drifted into uncertainty. The War of the Roses loomed on the horizon, a bloody echo of the 100 Years' War, now turned inward, as if the thirst for power had grown so great it could no longer see beyond its own shore. But history is never only ruin. Even in devastation, something endures. Wisdom, perhaps, or resilience. A deeper understanding of power and pride, of silence and survival. France would rise again, transformed not by victory, but by its own endurance. And England, too, would find its footing in time, though the crown now felt heavier, and the myth of conquest had faded like old parchment. This, too, is the truth of war. That its final gift is reflection, not glory, not gold, but the quiet recognition that everything changes, that peace, hard won and incomplete, is a kind of wisdom, and wisdom is a kind of peace. So close your eyes, let the wind of centuries drift gently across your dreams. What is broken can mend, what is lost can be remembered. And what endures is not only the tale of kings and battles, but the strength of those who walked through fire and still planted seeds in the ash. In the stillness that followed the storm, France stood like a forest after fire. Blackened trunks, smoke still rising, but deep in the roots, something ancient stirred again. The war had hollowed out the land, but in the hollow came space to breathe, and in that breath, the dream of a nation began to take form. Charles VII, once a mocked and uncertain dauphin, now ruled not merely as a king, but as a builder of legacy. No longer simply resisting collapse, he began to sow, not conquest, not vengeance, but institutions. From the ruins of feudal chaos, he forged a stronger crown, a standing army born not of lords' whims, but of the king's command. No longer would the fate of France hang on the uncertain oaths of barons. The coin was stabilized, taxes became organized, and justice no longer wandered aimlessly from fief to fief. A centralized state began to rise. Not yet modern, not yet whole, but steady. Gone was the fractured kingdom of the early war, where dukes outshouted kings and foreign tongues ruled city gates. In its place, a France more cohesive, bound by language, by law, and by the shared pain of survival. Cathedrals, once echoing with war prayers, now whispered songs of thanksgiving. Crops returned to fields long soaked in ash. Children played where soldiers once bled. Hope did not arrive in banners. It came in bread, in roof beams, in laughter at market stalls. Yet even as France was reborn, it did not forget. Joan of Arc, once condemned as heretic, now became a sacred ember in the French soul. She was not just a figure of faith, she was France's conscience. Proof that courage could come from the unlikeliest places, that destiny could speak with a peasant girl's voice. And so, the country she died for began to see itself anew, no longer merely a crown or a court, but a people, a land not just ruled, but shared. The 100 Years' War had not forged this vision, but it had burned away all that stood in its way. So sleep now, dear listener, cradle the soft hush of fields reborn. The worst had passed, the embers glowed, and in their glow, a nation found its name. Across the grey, wind-swept channel, while France mended her wounds and gathered her soul, England stood still, a mirror cracked and clouded, staring at a reflection it did not wish to see. The 100 Years' War had not just ended. It had unraveled, and in its wake, England did not find peace. It found silence, the kind that comes before a storm. Gone were the songs of Agincourt, the pride of Poitiers, the grand dreams of Plantagenet dominion. In their place, whispers in Parliament halls, brooding castles, a crown that trembled atop a weary brow. Henry VI, son of a warrior king, was no warrior. Gentle, pious, almost spectral. He seemed born not to rule, but to pray. Where his father, Henry V, had marched through fire and glory, Henry VI wandered through shadows and doubt, more monk than monarch, more symbol than strength. Under his uncertain reign, England teetered, its treasury drained, its nobility restless, its purpose adrift. And in this vacuum, old ambitions stirred, noble houses with long memories and longer swords. The House of York, the House of Lancaster, cousins by blood, enemies by destiny, as if the war with France had planted a seed, not across the Channel, but in England's own soil, a seed of civil reckoning, fed by pride, watered by grief. For even the victors of old now asked, what was it for? So many years, so many dead, so little gained. Normandy lost, Anjou abandoned. Only Calais remained, a lone outpost, proud and pointless. The empire, once dreamed by Edward III, now seemed a fevered tale, told to children to soothe defeat. And as the old knights died off, the new ones had no war left to fight abroad, so they looked inward. Feuds flared, power shifted, loyalty frayed. The War of the Roses loomed, a red flower, a white, symbols of blood, of claim, of destiny undone. England, once the hammer of France, now became an anvil to itself. Its villages would burn, its sons would fall, not in distant sieges, but in meadows and moors beneath their own sky. But even in this unraveling, there was something deeply human, a reckoning not of glory, but of identity. Who was England now? Without its war, without its continental claim, without its purpose forged in steel. The answer would not come quickly. It would rise through trial, through betrayal, through bloodlines broken and rebuilt, through silence and through fire. Sleep now across the water. Let the weight of war drift down at last. France has found her breath. England now holds hers on the edge of a storm of her own making. What remains of a war when the swords have rusted, the banners have faded, and the bones of kings lie quiet beneath cathedral stones? Stories, not merely facts, but echoes, not merely names, but meanings. The 100 Years' War did not vanish with the peace. It rippled forward, carried in parchment, in prayer, in song. And like all wars long enough to become legend, it was not merely remembered, it was rewritten. Chroniclers, cloaked in ink-stained robes, began the solemn work of shaping memory. In England, the old glories were polished bright, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, each retold with swelling pride as if to say, we were mighty once. In France, it was not the victories, but the resurrection that mattered. A tale not of conquest, but of survival, of a land nearly lost and a people who would not vanish. And in the quiet between the chronicles, Joan of Arc rose higher and higher. What history could not explain, myth embraced. She became more than maiden or martyr. She became memory's heartbeat, a bridge between the divine and the devastated, a flame against forgetting. Even those who once condemned her now spoke of her with trembling reverence. And centuries later, she would be made a saint. But all myths bend with time. England's kings were recast as tragic or prophetic. Edward III became the architect of noble ruin. Richard II, the poet-king lost in shadows. Henry V, the golden flame before the dark. And France, she emerged from memory like a phoenix, wounded but whole, crowned in her own soil once more. Yet still the stories disagreed. Was it a war of crowns or of pride, of nations or of dynasties, of right or of might? The truth shifted, depending on who held the quill. Historians debated, poets embellished, painters imagined. In time, the 100 Years' War became less a timeline and more a tapestry, woven from fragments of truth and threads of longing. Even Shakespeare took up the tale, turning Henry V into a hero of theatre, a voice that roused the English heart with verses echoing through candlelit halls. "We few, we happy few," he wrote, though the fields of France were less happy, and fewer returned. But such is the gift and curse of memory, that it is never still. It breathes with each generation, telling not only what was, but what we need to believe. And what did the people believe? That war could forge identity, that suffering could purify a nation, that somewhere amid the mud and smoke and mourning, something sacred had been revealed, not just about nations, but about the human soul. For even as the arrows flew and kings fell, there were hands that baked bread in the ruins, children who laughed in the shadows, mothers who waited at the edge of battlefields with nothing but a prayer. They, too, are written in the silence between the lines. The 100 Years' War did not end when it ended. It lived on in every village song, every stone cathedral, every field where wild flowers bloom over forgotten graves. It lived on in the myths we carry still, of heroism, of betrayal, of the high cost of crowns. So rest now, beneath the hush of history's long breath. Let the scribes close their books, let the poets whisper one last line, for in the end, all wars are written twice, once in blood and once in memory, and the second telling is the one that never ends. Not all wars end with peace. Some settle into the soil, like seeds left from a wildfire, waiting, dormant, but never dead. So it is with the 100 Years' War. It did not vanish when treaties were signed or when kings died in their beds. It became something quieter, a hum beneath the feet of Europe, a wound beneath the map. Even centuries later, you can feel its pulse, in the shape of France, its language woven tight across old dialects, its monarchy reshaped by war's long erosion, in the very idea of England cast no longer as an empire across the sea, but as an island nation, self-contained, self-questioning, carved by the memory of loss. Borders may be drawn in ink, but they are born in fire, and the borders shaped in those 100 years still linger. Normandy, Gascony, Calais, names spoken now with history's breath, but once screamed in siege and oath. And deeper still, beneath the names and treaties, the war left something more enduring, the modern nation-state. Before the war, France was a patchwork of loyalties. England, a monarchy extended by conquest. After the war, they were nations, not simply kingdoms, bound no longer only by crown, but by culture, law, and blood spilled together. The modern army, the standing tax, the printed decree, all born from necessity, all born from war. What fire could not forge, a century of conflict did. And in literature, the war became a touchstone. Each revolution that followed in France, in England, looked back at this war as both a warning and a foundation. Even in the world wars of the 20th century, generals marched through battlefields that once bore the footprints of Edward the Black Prince, of Joan of Arc. Even tanks rattled over fields where knights once rode into the dawn. The echoes grow quiet only on the surface. Beneath, they thrum. France's fierce pride in its survival, rooted in this war. England's recurring solitude from the continent, rooted in this war. The great alliance systems, the continental suspicion, the longing for union and the fear of it, all fed by the long ghost of 100 years that reshaped the continent's soul. Even now, children read of Joan of Arc in classrooms, kings are remembered in cathedral windows, and Shakespeare's Henry V speaks on stages lit by modern lamps. The past does not sleep. It lives in our stories, and this war lingers in more than stone. It shaped the very idea of what it means to belong to a place, to fight not just for a king, but for a country. Before this war, a soldier fought because he was commanded. After it, he might fight because he believed. In that transformation, the 100 Years' War never truly ended. It stretched itself, not into more violence, but into identity. Who we are, where we draw the line, why we remember. And so it endures, not in bloodied fields, but in museum halls, in border policies, in village flags, still fluttering above narrow streets where English once rang out like a foreign drum beat. Time does not bury all things. Some it preserves, folded into the quiet marrow of nations. The 100 Years' War is one such thing, and when you hear the echo, in a name, a tale, a speech, you are hearing not just history, but the voice of a war that refused to be forgotten. So sleep now beneath this long echo. The war is over, but its shadow walks beside us still, silent and shaping what we dare to call modern. In the midst of fire and shadow, a young maiden rose, her voice a clarion call, her spirit a flame that would not be quenched. Joan of Arc. Not merely a name, but an echo of resistance, a beacon in the dark. She was born of common earth, from the soil of Domremy, where the whispers of saints danced in the breeze, and faith was as natural as the river's flow. Yet she spoke with a voice that shattered centuries, commanding armies, inspiring kings, challenging the divine order with a courage both raw and radiant. Her story is more than war. It is the spirit of resistance incarnate, of the powerless rising, of the small claiming their place in the vast tapestry of history. Against invaders, against doubt, against death itself, she stood unyielding. Centuries passed, but Joan's flame did not flicker out. She became more than flesh and blood, a symbol for all who would stand when the world says no. For the oppressed, the forgotten, the silenced, Joan is a mirror, reflecting strength born from faith and fury. Across time and continent, her spirit has been claimed, reclaimed, reborn. In revolution, in freedom's cry, in moments when people rise against impossible odds, Joan's legacy burns bright. And yet, she is no myth to be tamed. She is a woman of flesh and bone, of doubt and devotion. Her trial by fire, her brutal execution, speak not just of martyrdom, but of a world afraid of change, of power challenged by truth. Her canonization, a final breath of recognition, centuries after her death, reminds us that history bends slowly to justice. Joan teaches us that resistance is not just battle, but belief. Belief in something greater than kings, than fear, than despair. And in this belief, we find hope. Hope that even in the darkest wars, light will find a way through the cracks, that a single voice, raised in courage, can change the course of nations. As you close your eyes, let Joan's spirit be a lantern in your night, a reminder that no matter how deep the shadow, the flame of resistance burns eternal. When the swords fell silent and the banners were folded, what was left behind? Not just broken castles, not only scarred fields, but something deeper, a legacy shaped in fire and shadow. The 100 Years' War was a journey without a clear end, a long unfolding of change, of kingdoms shattered and reforged, of identities born in conflict. It was the forging of France as a nation, the resilience of England as an island kingdom, and the awakening of what it means to belong. Cities rebuilt, lands reclaimed, lives reassembled from the shards of war. These are the visible echoes, but beneath them lies the invisible. The war carried in stories told by hearth fires, in songs sung quietly by the people, in the quiet resilience of those who survived. What endures is the memory of resistance, of hope amidst despair, of faith unbroken by the cruelty of battle. It is the whisper of Joan's voice that still calls across centuries, the echo of kings and queens who dared to dream beyond their thrones. It is the lesson that power is transient, that empires rise and fall like tides, but the human spirit, that is eternal. And as we sleep beneath the stars, we carry this legacy with us, a reminder that even in our darkest hours, there is a light to guide us home. So let the story settle softly in your mind, like the quiet closing of a book, a journey complete, but never forgotten. Beneath the vaulted skies of Europe, where cathedrals cast long shadows over silent stones, there lie the bones of kings, Edward, Philip, Charles. Names once spoken like thunder, now carved in fading Latin, softened by centuries. The war has ended, but the men who shaped it, who burned for glory, who ruled by sword and seal, have returned to dust. This too is part of the legacy, not just conquest or kingdoms, but mortality. For even those crowned by heaven could not escape the quiet truth, all things end. Their crowns rest in glass cases now, their likenesses etched in coin, their words echoed only in plays, in sermons, in scrolls pressed dry by time. What endures is not the breath of their command, but the consequence of their ambition. The 100 Years' War was not built by gods, but by mortals, afraid to be forgotten, and yet they were. What remains is not their power, but the ripple of their choices. A village changed, a language born, a church destroyed, a hero burned. We remember not because they were kings, but because we still live in the world they made. To walk through Rouen or Orléans, to stand on the windswept cliffs of Harfleur, is to walk among their ghosts. The stones remember. So do the fields. And so do we. History is not a monument, it is breath. It is the quiet exhale of a people who survived. And in that breath, we honor more than the thrones and treaties. We honor the peasant child who watched her village burn and still grew old. We honor the foot soldier who never knew whose crown he fought for. We honor the mother who lit a candle for her son each night, not knowing if he still lived. These are the truths buried beneath the crowns, that glory fades, but love remains, that conquest ends, but memory whispers forever. So what do we carry forward? Not the bloodline, not the crest, but the story. And in telling it, softly, slowly, we give meaning to the dust of kings. Let them rest now, those who rode into legend. Their swords are sheathed, their empires gone to seed. But we, the living, are their echoes. And so we speak their names, not in reverence, but in reflection. Close your eyes. Listen. The wind in the old chapel, the hush of the battlefield, long quiet, the breath of the child who dreams of courage. This is how memory endures. Let it settle now, this story of fire and fall, of crowns and crumbling thrones. Let it be carried in your sleep, in your silence, and know that even the dust of kings has something to teach us about time, about mortality, about meaning. सिस्ट आवी कुआट जुंग खत्म हो चुकी थी, मगर अमन ने तुरंत दस्तक नहीं दी। यह तो अक्सर होता है कि जहां तूफान गुजार जाए वहां हवा कुछ वक्त तक बेचैन रहती है। वक्त लगता है सब कुछ समेटने में, लहू, जख्म और यादों को। In 1453, The war that had torn across a continent finally fell quiet, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of exhaustion. Europe, like a body long fevered, lay still beneath a grey sky. The kingdoms of France and England, once bound in noble bloodlines and bitter claims, now turned inward. To rebuild, to count their losses, to remember what they had once believed. France emerged from the wreckage not merely as a land, but as a nation. Gone were the patchwork loyalties to dukes, counts, and foreign crowns. The French monarchy, though scarred and wearied, now held sway over a land that had begun to call itself whole. It was not just victory. It was identity. The fields of the Loire, the ruined towns of Normandy, the battered churches in Gascony, all spoke now in one tongue. Old boundaries blurred, old feuds faded, and in their place, a single word took root in the hearts of the people. France. England, meanwhile, returned across the Channel to find a kingdom broken from within. The crown had lost not just land, but faith. The nobles, once distracted by distant conquest, now turned their eyes to London and to the vulnerable house that wore the crown. Henry VI, fragile and unready, could not hold together the threads unraveling beneath him. And so began a different war, a civil war, a war of roses red and white, where brother turned on brother and peace became a rumor. The 100 Years' War had ended, but its echo had birthed new storms. Yet amid the ashes, new things grew. The common soldier, once voiceless, now carried stories that would shape a people's memory. The merchant, unshackled from feudal chains, began to shape the world through coin, not crown. The languages, English, French, once fractured and foreign, began to settle into the rhythms of poetry, prayer, and law. It was in this silence that Shakespeare's voice would one day rise and speak of kings and battles now gone. It was in this silence that Joan became more than martyr. She became symbol. It was in this silence that Europe turned not to conquest, but to questioning. For when the swords are finally sheathed, the mind begins to wander. Who are we, now that we are not fighting? What does it mean to belong? What, after all this death, is worth living for? The Renaissance would soon arrive, not as thunder, but as a sunrise after a long storm, and in its golden light, Europe would look again at itself, not in armor, but in reflection. So let us sit for a moment in that early dawn, when the blood had dried and the stories had begun. Listen to the hush of a library in Florence, to the crackling quill in Canterbury, to the song of a widow in Picardy, planting seeds in soil soaked with memory. This is history not as triumph, but as tenderness, not as conquest, but as consequence. In the silence after the storm, we begin to understand what the storm truly meant. So breathe. Let this quiet wrap around you. The kings are sleeping, the swords rusting, but you are still here, to carry the story forward. Not as battle cry, but as lullaby. In the quiet after the storm, one voice refused to fade. Not that of a king, not of a general, but of a girl who once rode into war, wearing armor made of faith. Jeanne, the Maid of Orleans, burned, betrayed, and broken by the world. And yet, somehow, she rose. It is the strange way of memory. Sometimes, death is not the end. Sometimes it is the beginning of something larger than flesh. Joan of Arc had died in 1431, condemned by men in robes and chains, branded a heretic, scorched to ash in Rouen Square. But 20 years later, the French crown, the very crown she helped restore, demanded the truth be heard again. And so the fire was relit, not in hatred this time, but in justice. A retrial, a public reckoning. Witnesses came forward, soldiers who had fought beside her, villagers who had seen her visions, priests who remembered the way her voice could still a room. They said she was not mad, nor a witch. She was chosen. She was true. And in 1456, her name was cleared, not by miracle, but by memory. But by then, she had already become more than mortal. In tapestries, she was a warrior. In paintings, a saint. In the whispers of old women in stone chapels, she was the girl they might once have been. France, still bleeding, still building, began to see itself in her eyes. Joan was not royalty. She was not rich. She was no man's heir. She was a peasant's daughter who heard something holy and dared to follow it. And that is the story a nation chose to carry, not the lineage of kings, but the courage of one girl against a world that doubted her. In her, France found its myth, not one born in conquest, but in conscience. For centuries, she wandered through history like a silent figure in a dream. Napoleon invoked her name. Revolutionaries carried her image. Churches prayed to her. Villages lit candles for her on summer nights. In her silence, she spoke. Then in 1920, nearly 500 years after her execution, the Catholic Church declared what the people already knew, that Joan was a saint, not because she was perfect, but because she was human and still chose light. And now, in the hush between centuries, we speak of her still, not with fire, but with reverence. What is sainthood, if not the memory of someone who reminds us what we could be? A girl who defied empires because her heart told her to. A child who stood before swords and tribunals with only her faith to clothe her. A voice unshaken in the smoke. History tells us that kings won the 100 Years' War, but that is only part of the tale, because when the war ended, it was not the king's face that echoed in the soul of the people, it was hers. A sword was placed in her hand by no army. Her coronation was not in a palace, but in fire, and yet she wears a crown greater than any throne could bear. The crown of memory. So if you walk one day in the streets of Orléans, listen, you might hear it. The echo of hooves, the whisper of prayer, the breath of a girl who still walks with her people. Let her remind you that truth is not owned by the powerful, that belief is not weakness, that one voice, even trembling, can move the wheel of history. Joan became a nation, not by force, but by faith, and in that she became eternal. जंग कभी सिर्फ तलवार से नहीं लड़ती, उसके बाद भी कभी सदियों तक उसकी गूंज, उसकी धूल और उसकी यादें जमीन पर रहती हैं. The 100 Years' War ended in 1453, but its shadow never truly lifted. It did not just redraw borders. It rewrote the meaning of nationhood, the rhythm of language, the power of law, and the shape of memory. Long before guns or parliaments ruled Europe, there were kings who ruled by divine right and nobles who spoke in Latin and lineage. But after more than a century of fire and ruin, a quiet transformation had begun. One not born in palaces, but in fields, in courts, in the words of common men who had seen too much death to be ignored again. Language first. Before the war, France was a patchwork of dialects and England a land where French still whispered in noble halls. But war teaches clarity and identity. The English tongue, once dismissed as rustic, began to rise. No longer the language of peasants alone. It became the voice of poets, of law, of kings. In 1362, the Statute of Pleading made it law. English was now to be used in court, and by the end of the war, it had become the language not just of law, but of the nation. Shakespeare's voice was now possible. Chaucer's pen had already begun the journey. The war had shaken loose the old French tongue from the English crown's mouth and made space for something new to bloom. In France, the reverse occurred. French, once only one dialect among many, began to stand above the rest. Orléanais, Picard, Provençal. All remained, but the French of the Île-de-France became the voice of government, court, and unity. Because to survive a war, a people must learn to speak the same story, and stories need language. Clear, shared, enduring. Then came law. Before the war, kings ruled by will, not by consent, but the cost of endless war had forced the crown to lean on the people, to tax them, to plead with Parliament, to justify each campaign. In England, Parliament evolved from a gathering of barons into something more lasting, not yet democratic, but aware of its weight. The people, through taxes and arms, had bought their seat at the table, and now they would not leave it. Even the divine right of kings began to tremble. For if a king could lose his land, if a queen could be burned, if a boy could be crowned by a peasant girl, then what truly made one royal? The 100 Years' War did not birth democracy, but it planted the idea that kings must answer to more than God. And so emerged the first quiet heartbeat of constitutional rule, a whisper, but one that would become thunder in centuries to come. And finally, legacy. The war left fields unplanted, towns scorched, villages erased, but it also left a deeper inheritance, a sense that nations are not only made by crowns, but by people. The archer on the field, the weaver who paid her tithe, the widow who buried her son beneath a tree he never left. They had shaped the world just as surely as any noble. And so, from the ashes of a medieval war, modern Europe began to rise, not suddenly, but steadily, with flags, with languages, with law, and with memory. Even today, when England and France meet on the football pitch, or in halls of diplomacy, or in books of poetry, there is something older beneath the surface. A story that was once written in steel and fire, and now lives in tongue and treaty. This is the true legacy of that long war, not just who ruled, but what endured. A shared past, a scarred but sacred history. A reminder that even in the fiercest storm, seeds are planted for a different kind of future. So listen to the wind across the channel. It carries more than salt. It carries stories. It carries words forged in fire. It carries us. When men fall, the earth forgets their footprints, but memory carves deeper than time. It lives not only in books or scrolls, but in the stones of silent chapels and in the songs of grandmothers who no longer remember why they hum. The 100 Years' War has ended, but Europe still walks through its shadow, barefoot and reverent. For a war so long, so bitter, so filled with gods and ghosts, cannot be buried in silence alone. Walk the quiet lanes of Normandy, and you will find them, tiny crosses nestled in forgotten fields, cobbled roads worn thin by boots that marched for Edward, for Charles, for a cause now dust. Cathedrals rebuilt from ruin stand like old men with stories in their bones. They do not speak, but they remember. The stained glass in Rheims, replaced after English fire, shattered the saints, still catches the light like it did when Charles VII was crowned. And in Westminster, tombs of kings bear Latin prayers carved by trembling hands. Some who prayed for victory, some who prayed for peace. Each chapel, each abbey, each battlefield-turned meadow is a book with no pages and a silence that says, "This happened." And yet it is in song that the war truly lingers. Not the grand orchestras of courts, but the old melodies. The kind sung beside a fire while a girl braids her mother's hair. The kind a shepherd hums when the hills are quiet and only the ghosts are listening. In England, the ballads of Agincourt are still sung with swelling pride. King Henry, he did fight so bold, with banners red and hearts of gold. The tune may be rustic, but the rhythm is memory. Drummed into the marrow, they sing of archers, of victory snatched by mud and fate, of the longbow's hum like a god's whisper. They sing of a time when the fields themselves chose a side. In France, the memory is different. Darker, deeper. They do not always sing of victory, but of the maiden, Jeanne, La Pucelle. She walks not only in history books, but in lullabies, in processions, in hearts that believe that sometimes God speaks through fire and listens through death. Each spring, the bells of Rouen still toll, not to mourn, but to remind that once, in a square blackened by wood smoke, a girl in armor changed the path of a nation with nothing but belief and tears. Pain and pride mingle strangely in memory. There are songs that swell with triumph, and those that ache with loss. But even in their dissonance, they bind. They create a people, a lineage of spirit stitched together by verse and prayer. There is also the architecture of forgetting, places built not to remember, but to move on. Markets paved over battlefields, statues placed where gallows once stood, universities rising from the rubble of abbeys. History is sometimes buried so it won't scream. But still, under the laughter of tourists and the chatter of students, if you place your hand on the stones, they will speak. They always do. In museums, a breastplate dulled with rust, an arrowhead bent with use, a banner faded like old breath. These are not relics. They are voices, not loud, but persistent. The 100 Years' War was never meant to be a lesson, but it became one, and as each generation steps forward, it must decide to remember in glory or in grief, to sing only of kings or also of the childless mother, the burned book, the plough that never touched soil again. France and England stand now as allies. Brothers who once drew swords now pass pens. Their flags, once soaked in each other's blood, now flutter side by side on embassies and Olympic fields. And yet, memory does not forget. It walks behind them like a shadow in sunlight. It holds the hands of history, soft and firm. Because in the end, to remember war is not to glorify it. It is to sanctify what it cost, to say with quiet awe, here once stood the storm, and here, still, walk the echoes. So sleep now beneath the hush of Europe's twilight. Let the stones cradle your dreams, and the songs carry you gently to the place where past and present meet like lovers in the fog. The war is over, but its memory, soft, sacred, sung, remains. The war has ended, but endings are rarely quiet. Not in the hearts of men, not in the bones of kingdoms, The 100 Years' War did not conclude with a trumpet call, nor with the triumphant lifting of a crown into golden dusk. It ended in silence, the kind that comes when the fires die and the field, still smoking, waits for green to return. It ended not with a victor's roar, but with a whisper, "Enough." But what endures? What remains after a century of ruin and rising? Not just names etched into marble, Edward, Charles, Henry, Joan, but something more fragile, more eternal. A sense that time itself bends under the weight of human longing, the longing to belong, to conquer, to remember, to be remembered. For war is never only about land or gold. It is about meaning, about the stories we tell to hold our place in the vast, uncaring dark. And for 100 years, the people of England and France wrote their story in blood and ash. They wrote it in the siege towers and the salt-soaked decks of warships, in the parchment of treaties and the trembling prayers of widows. The war taught kings to dream in strategy and peasants to dream in defiance. It taught archers to read the sky and monks to record loss with reverence. It taught us that identity is never fixed. It is fought for, shaped in the furnace of history. France, once a quilt of fractious duchies, emerged with a soul. England, tasting glory and grief, turned inward, toward its own stormy island destiny. And Jeanne d'Arc, who heard voices where others heard wind, remains not merely in statues or sainthood, but in the marrow of every soul who dares to believe in something unseen. She is the spirit that rides alone into impossible odds, the divine flame that flickers even when drowned in fire. She changed the war, but more than that, she changed how we remember it. History, for all its kings and battles, belongs to those who feel it, the soldier gripping a friend's hand as the arrows fall, the child left fatherless while church bells ring for victory, the woman who weaves linen to bury her son in silence. These are the historians whose stories are etched in breath, not ink. So what endures? Not glory, not power. These are passing, clouds. What endures is story, and the soft weight of memory, the way a grandfather tells of battles he never fought, but somehow knows, the way a poem survives a sword, the way silence speaks. After all, the shouting is done. And what does the war teach us? That kingdoms rise, but they do not last. That borders shift like sand, but the human heart, its capacity for courage, cruelty, and love, remains unchanged across centuries. It teaches us that suffering is never noble, but what we make of it might be. That belief in God, in nation, in justice, even when it falters, can still ignite history. The 100 Years' War was not only a war, it was a mirror. It showed us who we were, and who we might yet become. Not in the gleam of armor, but in the moments afterward, when the sword is sheathed, the grave is filled, and a mother teaches her daughter to plant seeds instead of sharpen knives. And so now, we lay this story down, not to forget, but to honor, to let it breathe in the hush between centuries as a lesson, a wound, and a prayer. Fall asleep now to the rhythm of distant bells. Let the past unspool like a ribbon in the dark. Let the cries of Agincourt fade into mist, and the fires of Orleans warm your dreams. Know that you have walked through 100 years, of sorrow and triumph, of kings and maidens, of ruin and rebirth. You have seen the slow beating heart of time, and you have remembered. That is what endures.